Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all who are joining us today for this webinar. I am with Charlotte Griffiths and Scott Foster here in Geneva, and we warmly welcome you all for a very interesting session. We will just give 1 or 2 minutes for people who are just starting to come in. Before we start, just a moment or two for people to come in. Okay, your microphones are muted by default, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a very engaging conversation. Please use the conversation function, and you see a button on the top with like a bubble, which could be used to comment or ask questions. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded to the UNEC website later. All presentations also will be uploaded to the website, the link of which you already have. Without much delay, I would like to hand over now to Sigurd Heiberg, who is a chair of the Commercial Application Working Group of the Expert Group on Resource Management. And I request him to further take this webinar forward. Over to you, Sigurd.
Thank you very much, Harry, and welcome to all. We're here to discuss how the UN Framework Classification for Resources can help channel investments into energy and resource projects for sustainable developments. We know that the changes required to meet these goals are really required, and they're very strong, meaning that we will see changes in policies. We don't know exactly what they will be, but the first speaker, Scott Foster, will take us through the thinking of the UN, and of course governments will also be reflecting on this. The industry and the finance sector will be facing a risk as to what policies will be in place when their projects are developed and produced. Professor Donald Roy Lazard, Professor Emeritus of the MIT Sloan School, will enlighten us on the dimensions of that before David McDonald, the chair of the Expert Group on Resource Management, will tell us how to group the numbers in the UN framework classification so as to facilitate the decision support. And Matthias Hartung will then show us an example of how the data can be presented for efficient and effective decision support. But before we start, let me recognize the expert group, the Commercial Applications Working Group and its members. You see the names here. This is really a capable, very capable group, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be allowed to chair this group. I will not go through the names. They will be available to you in the slides and on the web afterwards, but I want to recognize each and every one of these members as being true experts in their fields and the great support for the work that we are doing. So the next slide shows the detailed agenda, and we have come to the first point on this, which is Scott Foster. And without much ado, I will call of him. But first, let me present him. He is the director of the UNEC Sustainable Energy Division and has been for the last decade. He is a visionary that, together with his able staff, the Bureau of the UNEC Intergovernmental Committee on Sustainable Energy, and the committee itself, which consists of 56 member states of North America, Europe, former Soviet Union, Turkey, and Israel, are directing the UNEC Sustainable Energy Subprogram. Scott, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Sigurd, for your kind introduction. It does make me feel a bit old when you start speaking in terms of decades, but I guess I can live with that. It's a pleasure to be with you. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And it's really a delight to join you for this question of how the UN Framework Classification for Resources can channel investments into energy and resource projects. That's a topic that's been of great focus for the United Nations in the recent past, and we've had a series of regional workshops really looking at this question. And I know a number of countries are asking themselves, how can they be certain of obtaining the resources they require for sustainable development? They're also looking at the volumes of resources that are consumed and realizing that we can't do that for the going future. It's just not possible for current patterns to be sustained. So if you could go to the first slide, please. We had a meeting a while back, and I'll give you a bit of an explanation about UNECE. We had a meeting of directors a while back trying to sort out what we stand for, what we're trying to accomplish. And I've got a slide here. It's actually a single slide, but it's quite complex. And I think it'll help you understand what we're trying to achieve. So if you can just step us through here. Before I joined the United Nations, I was a management consultant, and I'd be hired by clients to help them with some strategic issues. And invariably, the first task had to be making sure we were asking the right question. Because if we weren't asking the right question, we certainly weren't going to get the right answer. So the first thing that we do in UNECE with all of our experts and governments and interactivity that we have, we go through a process of understanding what are the challenges that we face, what are the issues that we're trying to address, what are the approaches that we'd like to take. And there's a long process of going through sorting out what's to be done. So if you can just click through regularly, I'll speak through it. You end up getting these challenges identified, you agree to the actions, you have work plans that you can then get on with. UNECE is very much known for developing normative instruments. That's what we do. We develop policies, we develop tools, we go ahead and put them together and get agreement amongst all of the players. At the end of that process, you're going a little fast for me. At the end of the process, we get consensus. And the idea that 56 member states would come together and endorse the consensus that we have and come to an agreement. And that's a bit of a commitment that we're going to deploy and disseminate these instruments is critically important. We then say, all right, fine. We've had a meeting. We've got a report. Isn't that nice? It's going to hold up a place on my bookshelf. Who cares? At the end of the day, the objective is to mobilize real change. We want to change the behavior of governments. We want to change how industry is behaving. We want to actually have an influence across governments, citizens, and societies. And if you're going to get all of these changes, you have to come in and say, what's the best way to do it? Get there to be alignment and consensus. Really what we want to do is drive activities, drive investments into sustainable outcomes. This translates into trade, transactions, employment, as well as green. So it's not just a climate issue, it's actually the whole fabric of society, if you will. We can continue going then. What you end up getting is a different set of business models, and you've changed how businesses make their investments. That then flows right back through the system and changes in governments and citizens. And at some point, you end up getting national legislation put in place. And once nations have put those legislations in place, back you come up to business. Now we can freeze here for just a second. One of our divisions is the transport division, and they develop standards for cars. So if you look under your hood or under your bonnet, you'll see lots of standards under there that were developed at UNECE with the car industry and with governments having discussions. It's light bulbs, it's seat belts, it's how highways are organized and signs are prepared. Those then come out of ECE, and we don't have statutory authority, but governments will take that product and put it in as a legislative requirement. And that's just one of our committees. We've got a series of 7 committees, 8 committees that do the same kind of work. Ours is the Energy Committee. We can then continue going forward. What you end up as a result of all of this is dialogue, conversations. You're getting trust amongst the countries. It's a bit raising the emotional intelligence. And because of that, you're going to get economic cooperation. You're going to get integration. The objective at the end of the day is to achieve mutually beneficial economic interdependence. You actually want to build up a rules-based trading system, not building up walls. So the objective that we have is multilateral collaboration. And lo and behold, once you've done that, you end up having these objectives that are larger scale out there. What are we talking about? A 2030 development agenda for sustainable development. What are we talking about with both the 2030 agenda and the Paris Climate Agreement? And if you have that kind of collaboration, you're going to be able to accelerate implementation of the SDGs. You're going to get both regional outcomes, regional dialogue, and you'll have a global effect. The outcome of that at the end of the day is why the United Nations was set up. We're trying to avoid a repeat of what's happened before. No World War III, no conflicts. Let's do what we can together and achieve prosperity, quality of life, and well-being. So if you can click, there's 2 more clicks on this slide. And I've said this stuff, so just to go to the last one. And when you end up having, that's the picture of what we're about. Now, it doesn't matter if you're in your energy division or if you're in your transport or environment, that's the process that we're going through. So if you can go to the next slide, please. We in the energy sub-program, we've got a very structured sub-program with a committee and groups of experts, and I won't go into the details. You're welcome to look at our website if you want those. But our activities fall into 4 key areas. I'm going to end up with a sustainable resource management at the end, but the first one is the environmental footprint of energy. Right now, if you look at the fossil share of CO2 emissions, the energy share, 80% of CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, come from the energy sector. Clearly, you're not going to achieve the objectives of Paris if you're not prepared to talk about that. So we're really focused on things like carbon capture and storage, high efficiency technology, methane management, and that's all in that basket. A second basket is deep transformation of the energy system for what we need tomorrow. This has got to be market design. It's bringing in renewables. It's bringing in the right kind of flexibility technology. It's making sure that the citizens of the world have access to the energy services that they require to deliver quality of life without cooking our planet, which is what we're in the process of doing. A third area of activity called Pathways and Indicators, we're doing a lot of work collaborating with countries and trying to help them understand how their individual actions collectively add up to delivering on the 2030 agenda. Every country has got its own endowment of natural resources. Every country's got its own legacy of society, legislation, regulation, how it works. It's a cultural distance. So there's not one pathway that applies equally to everybody. What does matter is the collective, and that's what we're trying to do with this Pathways work, is have a discussion so countries can understand where they're coming from and get a collective agreement that delivers what we require. The final area is in the area of sustainable resource management. And as I've already mentioned, the amount that we consume, 11.9 tons of material per capita, that's the average, and it goes from 4 at the lower level up to 23 at the higher level. Those are big numbers. And if all of the countries in the world moved up to the higher level, and with growth even higher, we'd need 7 planet Earths to deliver that degree of resources. So we've got to deal with waste. We've got to stop with this linear thinking on how we go about developing resources. We've got to do it in line with the 2030 agenda requirements. We're going to need critical raw materials. We're going to need materials for development, and we have to make sure we're doing it in a way that's consistent and coherent, that delivers on the question, on the challenge. So if we can go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, we had a discussion, regional roundtables. The Secretary General has appointed a special envoy on financing the transition to sustainable development. And part of his purview, part of his mandate is on the extractive industries. So it really points to how important the extractive industries are to the financing agenda. And they went through in Africa and had a regional roundtable. They then went through, ECLAC had their regional roundtable. We have had ours in January. ESCAP in Bangkok, they had theirs earlier this month. And then the next one for ESQA, Middle East and North Africa, they'll be the final one before we go to a global roundtable. And the question is, where's that going to go? And we've made a recommendation under that. It's a 5-point action program, which really, and we're going to hear more about this today, but it calls for a new social contract, a contract that really accounts for what society's needs are, environmental needs are, it's just transition, it's fairness, it's all of these things. It gives a license to operate, but in a broader context. The second part is sustainable finance principles and a sustainable finance taxonomy, if you will. Getting the investment community to understand what are the requirements that need to be met in order for resources to be developed, and to have that conversation as part of the financing package. In the third item, and it's third because it's the heart, it's the middle, is a sustainable resource management system. We have the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources. Building on that will be the United Nations Sustainable Resource Management System, UNRMS. The one is more of a static classification reporting tool, and people who know more about it are going to tell you all about it in a moment. But then you get to the dynamic of the resource management system and trying to optimize each country working with what it's got and the way it can on their management of their resources to deliver outcomes for their citizens. We, the people, should be able to expect that governments are acting in the interest of improving the quality of life of citizens. This is the kind of management system that it brings in society to participate in that process. The fourth item is supply chain traceability. And the idea of being able to understand where resources have come from, to be transparent on their development, to deal with corruption and conflict and the rest of it is a critical aspect of the extractive industries, I'll say, or resource management more broadly. Finally, you have strategic environmental assessments, and there are tools out there thinking not just in today's terms, but tomorrow and the day after. How can you develop resources in a way that's consistent with management of our natural systems? I use a graphic often that shows planet Earth with a thermometer and a headache. We are awful caretakers of our natural systems. We need to be humble servants of the system within which we live, and we've got to do a better job of balancing what human requirements are human requirements as described by the 2030 Agenda, but also the natural system that's out there. So these strategic environmental assessments will try to balance that. That's some of the thinking from UNECE. I'm going to stop there. Those of you who know me know I could go on with Fidel Castro for 11 hours, but I won't do that to you. I will stop and I will hand it back to Sigurd Heiberg. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Scott. That was fantastic. I'm very glad you're so well prepared for this webinar. It sets the tone. And our next speaker, Professor Donald Roy Lazard, he is a professor emeritus of the MIT Sloan School. He's a thought leader in several subjects and has told me that his main interest is to understand how things tie together. His career includes executive education in projects and finance. He's very strong on that. And his students are executives and leaders of industry and government throughout the world. His list of achievements is, of course, very long. I'll only mention that he has been Deputy Dean of the Sloan School and manager of VP's Project Academy at MIT. Don, the microphone is yours.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to speak briefly about how the UN framework classification will surface the risks and opportunities in the energy transition. If we can go to the next slide. The Sustainable Development Goals sharpen the energy challenge in several ways. First, of course, they require providing energy to a growing population coming out of poverty, so we will need more energy. Second, they're going to require reducing and ultimately eliminating the greenhouse gas emissions, which will affect 70 to 80% of today's energy production. They also are going to require very significant reduction and elimination of local particulate and other local emissions. And as Scott said, they will require a new social contract in terms of who makes the choices about natural resource and energy projects, who benefits from those projects, and who bears the costs of those projects. The key point of our discussion today, of course, is that the Sustainable Development Goals will require very significant changes in policies. Those policies will impact industries. Those policies will impact which projects, which activities are viable. Next slide, please. Valuation plays a central role from a commercial perspective. Decisions regarding developing and operating a particular energy producing or resource producing asset hinge on commercial valuation. I don't want to go off into the finance textbook right now, but commercial value is generally defined as the net present value of free cash flows. So you look over time at all of the capital expenditures associated with the project. You look at the operating expenditures associated with the project. You look at the net revenues. And when you bring those together in a present value, if the number is positive, the project is a good one. If it's negative, it is not. The key point regarding policies is that policies regarding environmental and social effects will have a direct bearing on valuation. So their impact on the choices of private and public actors in the sector come through valuation. As Sigurd already said, and as Scott mentioned, the form and timing of the policy changes that must be made is highly uncertain. There are many different pathways. Different countries will choose different pathways. There are going to be lengthy arguments about which pathways are correct. So there's no single pathway, single valuation. So what we need is a mechanism that allows us to consider, if the policies were so-and-so, which projects would be commercially viable and still meet environmental and social goals. If we had an alternative set of policies, which projects would be improved, which projects would be impaired. And of course, those effects work through the cash flows, they work through discount rates, and the UNFC will have to be very transparent about that, because it's not just a single number, it's thinking about alternative futures. Stepping to the next slide. the SDGs and reaching the SDGs will increase risks, but it will also increase opportunities. And I've laid it out in a very simple 2x2 fashion here. So if you think of increased risks with no increase in opportunities, I think it's fair to say that traditional fossil fuel production is increasingly risky to investors, increasingly risky to society, is an activity that firms will want to begin curtailing, because as we have better environmental policies, more complete environmental policies, those things will be trimmed. On the other hand, looking up at the vertical axis, there's a lot we can do in terms of more efficient buildings, more efficient layouts of residence versus commercial versus industrial activities to change transportation patterns that would make sense at today's energy prices, that are kind of win-win, no-brainers in terms of improving energy efficiency and energy use. So those are purely increased opportunities associated with the sustainable goals, not that risky. In the upper right-hand corner, I've placed fossil fuel with carbon capture and storage. There's a big potential opportunity to have clean energy coming from fossil fuel sources, but capturing the carbon that is emitted. That's costly. That will happen if and only if there's a substantial carbon tax or carbon price and a set of other regulatory policies that are aligned. So if a company was going to make a big bet on fossil fuel with carbon capture and storage, they say there's a big opportunity, but there are tremendous policy risks associated with that opportunity. This is a very simple diagram, but I think it's a useful way to map some of the risks and opportunities coming forward. Okay, next slide. Any valuation is going to require a scenario or forecast of what the relevant policies will be over the lifetime of the project. There's no single standard. We are discussing using 3 types of standards in the illustrative valuations. The first would be the local standards or regulations currently in place. So given the local environmental and social standards, what are the free cash flows of the project? What is its technical and commercial viability? Another set would be the most stringent standards applied in a major region. Let's think of Northern Europe that has quite stringent environmental standards. If those standards were applied to each project, what would happen to the free cash flows of that project? What would happen to the commercial valuation of that project? And at some point, through discussion of the type that Scott talked about, there will emerge some selected Sustainable Development Goals compliant global standard that we could apply to all projects. The point here is we're going to have multiple standards, we're going to have multiple valuations, and we need to have a classification that is transparent in terms of doing that. Okay, next slide, please. The key question, and this is the big one, is to what extent does a particular standard or policy affect the commercial valuation of the project? And if it's green, it says you can impose the Sustainable Development Goals and the environmental standards and the social standards to a project, and it's not going to significantly impair the commercial value. So that set of projects is viable. That set of projects can go ahead. If it's red, saying that the project is commercially viable, but it badly violates environmental standards or it badly violates social standards, and it probably requires a great deal of remediation in order to be commercial. The most interesting projects and possibilities will probably be orange. There'll be projects that do not quite meet the standards on one dimension or another, but are close to being of commercial value within those standards. And then the spotlight will be on how can those projects be improved so they can meet the standards. As a national resource planner, it would be very nice to have a map of which of your raw materials projects are green, which of your raw materials projects are orange, which ones are red. Same thing for your energy projects. And the green ones, obviously, you'll try to accelerate. The orange ones, you'll spend a lot of time trying to move them into the green zone. The red ones, by and large, you're going to say, don't bother. So that's the key outcome here. One more slide. Of course, valuation is going to be done at different levels by different parties. The UNFC is very focused at the project level, so that would be a wind farm, an oil field, a particular hydroelectric project. It could be focused on the specific asset within the project. It might be focused on a portfolio of projects. It might be focused on all of the assets and projects of a company within the national jurisdiction. It might be focused on all of the projects and resources by all companies within a particular jurisdiction, or it might be focused on all of the assets and projects held by a particular transnational enterprise. When you look at a lot of the work that is being done in terms of financial disclosure, those people are largely concerned with the risks and opportunities at the level of the enterprise. The government regulator, on the other hand, is much more interested in the risks and opportunities that occur within her or his region. And the company that is making the decisions about going ahead or not going ahead with the project is really worried about the metrics at the project level. The beauty of the UNFC with its project level focus is that a portfolio is just the sum of some projects. An enterprise within a jurisdiction is just a sum of, again, some projects. Everything that's happening within a national jurisdiction is just the sum of a bunch of projects. So this is an additive measure. We can put them together. We can keep track of the individual pieces. And Matthias and David will speak more about this. Final slide, I believe. There's a lot of action in financial markets dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals. The International Financial Reporting Standards Board, for example, has recently gone for comments on this. Nearly 600 firms commented and responded. They're very favorable to having better sustainability standards. The Financial Stability Board has done the same. We view the UNSC as very complementary to those. We believe that the project focus will help ground this and help us focus on decisions that are being made by firms within particular jurisdictions, within particular portfolios. So if we're going to get there, as Scott said, we need the tools. The UNFC, I believe, promises to be an excellent tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. I see we are a bit ahead of schedule. David, are you on?
Yes, sure am. Yep.
Then let me introduce you quickly. As you all know, numbers really matter, and as Don told us, and David McDonald will take us through the all-important subject of sorting the numbers in the right categories for the resource management. David is the able chairperson of the expert group on resource management and has been the force behind extending the UNFC to the range of commodities that it currently handles. He's a former vice president of BP, responsible for segment reserves. So he has this under the skin and has had for a long time. There couldn't be a better chairman. I'll give you the floor now, David. The microphone is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Sigurd, and thanks for the previous speakers for their presentations as well to set this up. So I am going to talk a bit about project classification and why I believe it's important and actually essential in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and really to optimize, improve, and use all of our resources in a full and complete manner. So if we could jump to the next slide there. So really, if we think about the rationale behind resource classification, we've got a number of different stakeholder groups. We have governments, we have the industry, businesses, we have the finance community, which made up of both banks, but also of individual investors, just the people on the street who are investing in these developments, and also the individuals in the communities and social areas that have the social license around investigating all of the studies that we're doing. And then finally, we have creators of these large energy and mineral studies, groups like the EIA, NGOs, and other groups that are interested in how volumes are going to be used in the future. All of these stakeholders need to make decisions about which projects are the best ones to take forward. And in all these cases, to make these sorts of decisions, these stakeholders need data. And the most essential data they need is, what is the project going to deliver? What are the implications of that project? How are they going to affect both the society around them, the environment, and what's the ultimate deliverability of that project to take forward? What the expert group on resource management that I chair within the United Nations looks at is trying to provide tools and data for these decision makers to ensure that the paths that they're choosing to take are the most appropriate ones, or at least ones where they know that the rationale behind the choices they're making are well founded. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So if we think about resource data sources, really to make an estimate of about where a project's maturity and the value of that project, and by value I don't just mean dollar value, I mean the value of everything that it's going to provide. We really look at there's three groups of individuals and specialists that come into this. There's the commodity specialists that look after that commodity and can make good quality estimates about it. There's the project and facility engineers that go into developing the project, and the commercial specialists around that. And I think that's really well described by the little figure I have here. This is taken from the Society of Petroleum Engineers Petroleum Resource Management System, but it holds true for any commodity. So you can see that really all three of these groups, looking at the reservoir, so in the case of petroleum, whatever that deposit is of the resource, the property, how is that property defined, who owns it, what are the deliverables from that, and then finally the project that's going to be used to develop that resource. All three of those go into developing an estimate of what are the recoverable resources with that project. And what that amount is going to vary by each of the individual stakeholders, but all three of these groups need to come together. These three disciplines all have a role to play in making the estimate of that project. And it's only if these three different disciplines work together that we can come up with this understanding of what the value of that project is. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And I think you can think about this, these three different, these disciplines are working within are solving the problem in the 3D space. So if we look at each of these different axes as part of a 3D view on the project, you can see you could make up these three different axes. First being the economic, social, and environmental readiness factors. So how advanced is the project, both economically and socially and environmentally, all the social license issues that need to be resolved and understood. There's the technological readiness. So how easy it is to do this project. Do I know how to do it? Do I know how to recover this resource in an efficient manner? Can I do this? And then the last axis is really the quantification of it. What is the value of this project? And again, I'm not just talking resources. I'm talking the resources, but also the social implications of it, perhaps CO2 emissions, perhaps number of jobs added to the community. All these issues that go into evaluating a project sits on that quantification axis. And by thinking about your project and making an assessment of your resources on this sort of an axis here, we can start to understand the maturity of the project and I start to identify what are perhaps the barriers to progressing that project. Because it's all great and good to have a knowledge of a fixed, static view of our project, but all these projects are ones that we want to choose the ones that we want to advance. And to advance them, we need to understand what are the barriers to that advancement. And that's what we hope to use this as a project. If we could move to the next slide. What I'm going to do now is take that three-dimensional view that I just showed you there and flatten it. So I've rotated that view so that the quantification axis is now going into the page there. So we're really only looking at the economic, social, environmental, which I call the ESE, readiness factors axis versus the technological readiness factors. Now, readiness you can think of as the potential of a project to advance, to cross to that next level of maturity. And if we look at the two axes, I've simplified this down. You could make many different criteria for how you want to break up your axes, but I've just done it very simply here for our discussion today to say that there's a couple of simple barriers that we need to back off. So the highest level of economic and social ready would be that I've made commitment to do this. I've made a final investment decision that I'm going to take this project forward. So I've put a bar there at the top. So there's a threshold there of commitment that I need to get across. And I put a lower bar there saying that I have some barrier to resolution. So projects that sit below that are ones that there's a significant issue that needs to be overcome to be able to take that project forward. Those that sit into that middle band there are ones that I probably don't have a significant issue to come to resolution to, but I haven't yet made the decision to take it into make a final investment decision on progressing that project forward. On the technological spectrum there, I've broken it into three buckets here. The first being these are aligning with a capital value process, stage gates, which I think fit very neatly with the project progression. And I've defined these as the projects that are in the defined stage still, or ones that we haven't yet really clarified what the project is. Ones that are sitting that have yet to pass the execute stage. These are ones where I'm kind of finalizing the project issues, and then lastly, those that projects that I have full understanding about how to take them forward, and I understand how to execute and to operate those projects. So I think you can see that any project could be located at some place into this grid to describe its maturity, both on the that economic social axis and on the technological readiness factor. And the neat thing here is that a project's always going to be classed as just a single place on this grid. It might appear that you've got a project that sits at multiple locations, but if you've done that, you probably haven't actually ring-fenced the project correctly. And what you may have is a project that consists of multiple parts. And so actually there are multiple projects. But normally, we can quite clearly place a project somewhere within this grid to describe its maturity. If we pop to the next slide there, please, Harry. So if you go ahead and do this, kind of a typical way to think about project maturity, it's kind of the classical way of doing it, is that we have projects that start into a predefined stage, go into the definition stage, and then they're ready to execute. And you can sort of think about it, there's a nice line there that goes up from that lower left corner up to the upper right-hand corner in this, and we just move along that path, and everything's great. But in reality, that's not the way things happen in real life. What happens is we progress the project in this space at different speeds. There are some projects that develop quite quickly on the technological side. They're projects that we know how to do very easily. They fit a pattern or a template of things we've done in the past, and we can progress those very quickly along that technological readiness factor, and perhaps faster than we can along the economic, social, and environmental axis. And an example of this might be, an oil development, an onshore oil development that's quite straightforward for us to do. We understand all the technology behind doing that. but the local community may have some concerns about that, and it might be in an environmentally sensitive area, and we're going to need to put in additional checks and technologies to make sure that we take care of those concerns and issues. So a project that might be very advanced might ordinarily sit into that execute phase in the technology stage. It may have a very strong barrier to resolution. So rather than sitting in that blue box that says execute there, it may actually be sitting down into in that lower right-hand box, because it still needs to overcome those barriers to resolution. If you go to the next slide, please. So there's to show you this, is that projects actually sit in many different places within this matrix. And what we're trying to do with the United Nations Framework Classification is identify and classify projects along these levels of readiness on these different axes. And in the UNFC, we call the economic, social, environmental axis the E axis. The technological readiness factor, we talk about being the technological feasibility of that. We call that the F axis. And we classify our projects along these two axes to define their certainty. You might notice I've left one square there uncolored, and that's because that's a square it's unlikely to have projects sitting in that space, but you certainly can. That would be identifying a space that's fully economically ready, and there's no social or environmental impediments to going forward with that project, but it's at a very early stage of its technological readiness. You probably wouldn't put something there, because if you don't really know how you're going to do something, you can't really say it meets all of your economic criteria. So you probably wouldn't place something there, but the system can handle it if you ever did want to do that there. Harry, go on to the next square there, please. Next slide. So we've looked at that EF plane there. We'll now have a quick look at the quantification plane, which sits out the other dimension there. And we call this the G axis for no other reason other than it's EF and G going forward there. This is a bit different than the other two axes. While E and F describe clearly the maturity of a project on those two axes, this axis is really a place where we can describe the range of value associated. And this is going to be both monetary and non-monetary. So it's both fiscal and non-fiscal. The types of things that we want to look at here are resource volumes. What are the emissions that are there? What is the net present value? Production profiles, quantified impacts that it can have on the local economy are just some of the various values that can be captured here. And which ones are most important will depend on what the commodity is, who the stakeholder is, and what actually is the decision that's trying to be made around that project. Is it being compared to other projects, or is it being evaluated in and of itself? And I've broken this again up into three different spaces here. This is because I like to make sure that people are recognizing that the UNFC is not simply about capturing a single value, but it has the space to capture a range of values and even whole profiles if that's necessary. Because understanding the volatility of our estimates, because they are just estimates, we have to recognize that there's great uncertainty in these numbers, and we always need to make sure that we're capturing the full range of potentials with these. And Harry, if you go to the next slide, please. So if we think about this project maturity assessment piece, so if we look at the E and the F axis, they're broken down again, as you remember, into three different maturity axes. Each axis has a set of tests behind it, criteria that you need to follow to be able to advance from one level to the next level along those axes. And once on each of the axes you've made that assessment using the criteria for the different tests, you can take those and jump forward and place your project within that space to understand where you are in that maturity. And when you combine these maturity tests, so for the E and the F axes, you'll have a total project maturity, and generally that will map very cleanly onto the capital value process stage gate for that. And I've just got a quick little subset of an example of some of the criteria that you might use for the for the ESE axis on the next slide. If you could jump to that, Harry. Oops, I'm sorry, one along there. So first off, we actually go ahead back one there. So what we try and do for each of the axes is develop little assessment matrices, and we're doing these right now as part of the thinking around how we can use the UNFC for resource management as part of the United Nations resource management system, is building assessment matrices. So each of the axes will have its own simple matrix that can be thought of as a checklist of all the key issues that need to be looked at and evaluated to test the maturity of a project. And effectively, what you get is a score at the end of it. You go through and look at each of these different criteria or tests and rate how advanced each of these are for the axis. And at the end of that, you can have a look at what the total maturity is and the rationale for why you put a project into each of these spaces. Typically, you would then assess the total maturity for the axis based on looking at what the minimum value maturity that you assessed it at, but there may be reasons to use a different value for that. If you go to the next slide there now, Harry, I've just taken out just a slight example of what some of the issues that might want to look at for the E-axis maturity. So you can see I've got 5 different tests here. Access and entitlement. So do you properly own and have entitlement to the resource? Market and sales connectivity. Will you be able to sell or get to market and sell this asset? So is there some sort of connection, a pipeline, cabling, whatever is necessary to utilize it? Do you have authorization and commitment from local governments and the local society? Does it meet economic criteria? And does it meet economic and social conditions? And then you can see that for each of the 3 buckets that we looked at on the E-axis maturity, we've got criteria that need to be met to be able to progress those forward. And you can see the words there that just briefly describe some of the needs there. So for example, for access and entitlement, to have full commitment, you would need to have all licenses and agreements in place to be able to say you had full access and entitlement to that. If you're sitting within the limited barrier to resolution, that you have those in place, or you've got reasonable expectations that they'll be in place very quickly. And if you've got a barrier to resolution, you may have some issues associated with those that need to be resolved. And you will have these sorts of tests for all the axes, for all the different criteria. And given what your personal circumstances are, what you're trying to look at to make that decision, the tests and criteria may vary. But ordinarily, on the E and the F axes, the tests are generic enough that they hold true for all commodities. This isn't something that's specific to petroleum, to solar, to wind, to minerals. These sorts of tests are very generic in their view looking forward. Next slide, please. So again, take these tests from the 2 axes, put them together, and we can have a unique assessment of the maturity. And what that should give us is a view of where we are on the stage gate. It'll tell us also perhaps if we need to have a stage gate review, if something's starting to progress to where we think something's at a maturity level that we think it's ready to progress, we know we need to have some sort of an internal or external review on that. And as I said, these tests are independent, and where there are circumstances where commodities do come into play in this will often fall on the G-axis where you're making those assessments there. Okay, final slide there, Harry. I think it's the last slide. Yep. And so, so really what we're looking at to do with the UNFC and the UNRMS is to build a consistent classification and management system that can be used for all of our resources, independent of commodities, so minerals, petroleums, renewables, uranium, injection, anthropogenic, water, all sorts of different resources. And this matrix that we're developing can be used for any of these commodity. And the real power of it is it gives us for the first time a consistent framework for the comparison of different projects at different stages of development to make sure that decision makers have the access to the tools to make the right choices to take forward. And I think in this day and age where we're starting to identify that sustainable reporting is becoming more and more important. And actually, just in the last week or two, several of the exchanges and governments have stressed the need, the SEC, the IASB, have all stressed the need to have greater transparency in the reporting of sustainable issues. This is a tool that can be used on a consistent framework to present that data. And we're hoping to start working with the IFRS Foundation, the SEC, and some of the other groups that are working in this space to take this forward quickly. So I'll stop there, and I think we'll have questions later on, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, David. That was very, very good and a fantastic introduction to our next speaker, Matthias Hartung. He will now unfold what we have heard by showing how the numbers contained in the UNFC can help support decisions of the UN, governments, industry, and finance to channel investments into energy and resource projects for sustainable development. Matthias is a highly capable executive consultant on data and digital transformation with a strong career in Shell behind him. I look forward to hear what you have to say, Matthias. The microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Sigurd. Thank you, everyone, for joining. So I've got two good news for you. One is there's question and answers after my talk. And two, for those that are particularly in the East, where it's getting late, the session is recorded. You can see and hear the full thing afterwards. So with that, what we have heard so far was Scott explaining us about the need and the onset for a new social contract that is really needed to look at prosperity, the planet issues, and the people issues. And we've heard Don talking about how this means opportunities and risks in a commercial sense. We have heard from Dave all the good work that has gone into the many years of designing and developing the UNFC. And what I would like now to do is to show you practical applications of the UNFC for you, whether you are a policymaker or decision maker in the investment industries, whether you are resource project managers, whether you're a regulator on a national level, on a local level, community level. For all of those stakeholders, we would like to bring now the UNFC to life. Next slide, please. And so basically adopting the United Nations Framework Classification for Sustainable Development of Resources has already been done. It has been used primarily for disclosure and reporting of resource volumes. So the classification is already active. However, the UNFC can do much more. I think I particularly like the fact that it allows us to compare and contrast across different resource types. So whether you're on energy or on other resource volumes, anthropogenic, minerals, oil and gas, coal, nuclear, renewables, it is for all of those resource types. And if you have projects that you want to compare and contrast across these types, you can do that. So it is addressing the lowest level is at project level, but of course you can aggregate them to portfolios. And of course you want to test policies and scenarios against those portfolios. So each of those steps are aggregation steps, which you can do when you look at it from when you start at the project level. And we want to compare and contrast not only on commercial terms, we want to compare and contrast to get people aspects. So think about employment in country as one example. We want to contrast and compare projects against planet aspects. Think of sustainability aspects like greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 equivalent emissions. And the third one on prosperity, not only on financial and commercial terms, but also in terms of quality of life for the stakeholders. And we want to demonstrate this with what we have done now is build a minimum viable tool to just show what this system can do. The tool that I will now share with you is based on established resource management system. It's a data management system for the energy industry, and it was quite simple or straightforward, let's put it this way, to extend this to cater for the UNFC classification, but also to cater for the different volume types that we can look at, not only resource volumes, but also elements on the social impact and on the environmental impact. We want to use this tool for practitioners, and it is aimed for those, and we want them to use it and to improve it. So it is not perfect yet, and there will be lots of aspects that you would like to have in this. And this is the idea, that you start with a small tool and you build and you make it work for you in your local, national, or intergovernmental context. We want to support the UNFC adoption and also identify further gaps in there. This can only be done by practicing, by using it. And the whole aim, of course, is making well-informed decisions, data-driven decisions on sustainable resource management. We know classification is working. We now want to make sure trusted data systems and trusted data is available for decision makers to make well-informed decisions. Next slide, please. So the roadmap to what we've done so far is we started with a very simple minimum tool. So the functional requirements were very brief. Start with the resource volumes and forecasts. Start with financial parameters like cash flow. Start with social parameters like local employment. And start with environmental aspects like the CO2 intensity or greenhouse gas emissions. Make it extendable, meaning you may wish for other socioeconomic environmental quantities. Think about other social aspects like land use or impact on archaeological sites. Think of other environmental sites like simple things like reindeer populations, which may matter in some countries and not in others. And think about non-quantifiable criteria that you want to list as well. And then make it scalable. Start at the project level, but also be able to look at it at a portfolio level, make it possible to look at scenarios, to test scenarios, and the consequences of materiality and impairment of those policies against projects. Make it viable, meaning make it valuable to the end users. So using it must deliver value to the end user wherever you are. And a tool stands basically for you can use it today. It's not a promise. It's not a report. It's something that helps you to finish the task. You see a little staircase what we've done. We started with a resource management system, extended on the environmental aspects. The UNFC environment, which means the other classifications. We started with input data. We added the origin category. We updated input data. We've used a lot of data which is either public source, so in other words, it was available through public access, or we made project data which is from the dimensions similar to real projects, but we couldn't use the real projects, so basically these are mock-up data, but realistic mock-up data. And then we created information panels, display panels, and that's where we are now. Basically, now we're in this loop of getting feedback, using it, and this is where we are today. Next slide, please. So let me show you this tool. It starts very boring with an input data. You can input the data either manually or through APIs, which means basically automatic upload from existing data repositories. It started with a petroleum system, oil, gas, non-associated gas, condensate, but we can easily add additional quantities. So for instance, greenhouse gas emission equivalents, employment numbers, you name it. It's just, and if there's something missing that you would like to see in there, the database is structured in such a way that you can always add another data type. Next slide, please. It is scalable, means you can have different reporting levels at a project level, at an aggregated portfolio level, at an asset level, at a country level. You can have different input frequencies. You may want to update your reviews on a monthly basis, on a daily basis, on an annual basis. And you, of course, have all the UNFC classes and categories listed here. So when you see UNFC 111, that means EX is 1, FX is 1, and the GX is 1, just as Dave just explained. Next slide, please. Very important to me is that we have an audit trail and we have a quality assurance as part of the process. So there is a capability to capture the report of the quality assurance. This could be done by a qualified person or an institution or a competent institution or whatever the legislation in jurisdiction is in your circumstances, you can make sure that the data that you have can be trusted, and the report that links to the assurance and the assessment of quality is available. Next slide, please. So this is the very famous 3D plot of the UNFC categories. 3 dimensions in terms of the vertical axis is the environmental, social, economic viability, that's the E-axis. The technical feasibility is the F-axis, and the degree of confidence is the G-axis. In the extractive industry, you would say the geological confidence, that makes much sense, the G, otherwise it's the degree of confidence. And you see the color coding here is that projects that fall under, that are completely viable, they are in the E1 axis, and they may have different areas of confidence, but they are E1 and then having different Gs and F1. So these are the green ones. Then you have potential viable projects, you have non-viable projects, etc., etc. These color codings you see, and also added to this are the produced quantities, because between an opening and closing balance, let's say within one reporting year, also some of the products may have been sold or may have been consumed in production. We find that for presentation, the 3D of the UNFC classes, it's good to show in 3D, but the 3D does not work well when you actually look at numbers. So next slide, please. What we've done is basically flatten the 3D into 2D. Now let me explain. If you look at the top row, you will find numbers like 111, 112, 113, etc. These are the UNFC categories. These are the resource categories, and the top row, the horizontal row, is the closing balance, and the vertical to the left is the opening balance. You see the same categories there, and so these are then the volumes. In this case, it's hydrocarbon volumes, but on the right-hand side, you see a matrix which looks at deployment numbers. And as David said, each of those boxes is basically a project. Now, but in a portfolio, you may have different volumes in different categories. So you're looking at the opening and closing balance, let's say, of hydrocarbon volumes, and you see any numbers that are below the diagonal, below the green diagonal, are projects that are moving up, they are maturing. But also the opposite can happen is, as Dave explained, some of those projects may be deteriorating, so they are above the diagonal. And so this is how this basically input-output tables work. This is how you can actually visualize numbers, and you can look at opening and closing balances of resource volumes. Next slide, please. Now, you can do this. We found, by the way, in using that we may actually miss some categories. So we have now already talked about the produced volumes, the NP, but we also find that there are others like extensions and transfers, discoveries and revisions. Those happen, and they're not always very straightforward to report. So this is coming out of using this tool, and I'm sure we will have more discussions about these details. The other piece that I would like to say is that learning by doing is what we find, but also the other piece is that you can, of course, have different, for a portfolio, different volumes reported. Any quantity can be reported that is associated to a project. Next slide. And here's what I mean. Here is a portfolio of hydrocarbon volumes and the equivalent of greenhouse gases, or you can also make employment numbers. So you can see each input-output tables can have the volume that you would like to look at. And it could be emissions, it could be financial volumes, it could be resource volumes, any quantity that you would like to look at in those opening closing balances and those input-output tables, you can display, and therefore you have them all associated. Next slide, please. Now we're looking at the display of the results, the dashboard. To your left, you see a map. We chose a world map, not in quite a world map, but part of the world. And those are the projects that we have looked at. Now, of course, this is a makeup database. You would like to use it in your context. The filter options you have is you can filter by country, You can filter by resource type. So do you have solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric, other resources? By UNFC categories. You can use by the range of the category. So let's say you only want to look at major projects that can deliver a significant amount of energy to the country. You can look also at the social measures. For instance, you only want to look at projects or a portfolio with projects which have a minimum number of employees associated. Then you can look at one project, you click on this and you can see the details, where it is, what's the duration of the project, what resource type, what categories it has in terms of the resource estimates in the different UNFC categories. You can look at the total life cycle resource in terms of how much energy it delivers, what is the equivalent of the CO2 emission, what's the duration of the project to build, what's the number of people employed for the construction phase, then for the operational phase, and the total finance needed. You have more volumes there. Anything that's in a database, you can display here. Next slide. Now we come to compare and contrast. So we chose now 3 projects, and of course it's a made-up example. One is a solar project in Oman, the other one is a hydrocarbon project, also in Oman. And then we didn't have an hydroelectric project in Oman, so we chose one in Turkey, and we took the data that is available in the literature. And now we can compare and contrast those projects along these items that we've chosen. What's the life cycle duration? How much resources does it deliver in terms of energy? What's the CO2 emission? What's the construction time? What's the employment numbers? What's the financing? So you can compare and contrast actual projects across resource types. Next slide, please. Now you can also look at a singular project. In this case, you want to have steam prepared for an industrial project. And so the steam and generation is only looked at. It's a very particular project. You want to see, can I do solar and generate the steam in Oman with solar, or should I use hydrocarbon? And then you can again compare what does it mean on the CO2 emissions, what does it mean on the employment numbers, etc., etc. And we saw, of course, that the solar project is much more advantageous on the CO2 emissions. But in other countries, maybe employment numbers are very important. In this case, the employment numbers on the construction phase is similar, and the operation phase is different, but still orders of magnitude comparable. But there are countries which may be living heavily on coal or on other energy types, and it's much more important for them to also look at the other aspects and find the right balance. And with this tool, they can be data-driven. Next slide. Sensitivities, testing policies. So in this case, we tested the impact on projects if there was this carbon tax. And there are 4 cases here, no carbon tax on one on $30 per ton, $50 and 100 ton per CO2 equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see all the financial parameters in the table. And then in the chart below, you see the after-tax cash flow of the present value for 10% discount. And you see that actually 3 of them still fly are positive in terms of cash flow. And the yellow line, which is the $100 case, actually the computer program is programmed in such a way at the moment that it says it is not a 1-1-1 project anymore, which means it's not economically viable. It doesn't generate a positive cash flow, so I can't calculate. Of course, we can change that. But the nice thing is you can easily see already that where the boundary is in terms of which projects are significantly impaired if you would raise a carbon tax of $100 per ton. Next slide, please. And of course, you can plot not only the cash flow, but you can also plot the product volume, in this case it's oil, and also the greenhouse gas emission over the years of the project. So you can do these plots for any resource category, and you can of course calculate we have calculated using a sustainability reporting standard, and this is also an issue because there is not a single one, there's many. And that brings me to the next slide. So we looked at our studies, took those sources for calculating equivalent CO2 emissions, and they may not be correct, and it may be a good debate on which one is correct. But we can see that all of those energy types, whether you have solar, hydrocarbon, or hydroelectric, have CO2 emissions. None of them is zero. Yeah, there are always contributing factors. When you build, for instance, a dam with concrete, that at current production, we would generate CO2. In the future, we may use renewable energy for this, but currently that's what we have to calculate. And that brings us to the next slide. Our learnings from early adoption of the UNFC is, first of all, we find 2D representations work much better. We need reporting requirements in terms of to cover the production and non-sales volumes. We look at revisions. We need to look at transfers, discoveries, and extensions. That's a small aspect. I think the one that is very close to what also Dave and Don said before is we need a single reporting standard that is applicable and widely accepted on sustainability reporting, like carbon intensity. On financial reporting, I think that is already in place, but also how do we calculate other aspects like employment and other quantities that matter to decision makers. We would like to leverage more the UN International Centers of Excellence, because that's the place for practitioners, for learning by doing, and where we have a sandbox environment for seeing what works and how can you solve the questions that decision makers have. And the tool that I've presented today is meant to be used in that context. We would like to have more adoptions. We would like to learn more so we will welcome the dialogue with adopters who have project or portfolio data. We can work with full confidentiality and want to make sure that the UNFC is working for you and that we all learn through use cases. And that brings me to the conclusion slide. What I've shared with you is the UNFC works to compare and contrast projects across resource types. You can aggregate it to portfolios and policies, and you can test their impact on people, planet, and prosperity aspects. There is a minimum viable solution that exists to build trusted data systems. We need more than classification. We need trusted data systems so that decision makers can be data-driven, and that double materiality assessments, meaning not only commercially viable projects, but also attractive, materiality attractive projects in terms of social aspects and environmental aspects can be assessed at the same time. So the UNFC becomes like a negotiation tool. It can balance and have an integrated view on resource management. It can help resolve conflicts and hopefully can create the win-win-win on the people, planet, and prosperity side. And that's exactly the mission of the UN: resolve conflict, peace, and prosperity. And so we would welcome the dialogue for well-informed decisions on sustainable resource management. Thank you very much. And the last slide is just to acknowledge, I would like to acknowledge Target Energy Solutions, who has developed this tool that I've presented on a pro bono basis. And I also would like particularly thank Norbert Westerhuis for translating the functional requirements into a technical solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. That was very good, and it completed our presentations. And I hope this has given you the impression that it is a solid build from top to bottom, no loose strings. You can discuss policies, you can see what the effects are, and you can gauge how to manage the advantages, the opportunities, and also mitigate the risks of any policy change or any other change that happens during the course of a project. So it is a very, very, very strong pattern that we have been witnessing. And now we have come to the Q&A, and Harry and I will try to cooperate to get answers to the questions you have asked on the chat. And Harry, with your permission, I would like to start with the question of Mustafa Koroma. He asks, in the bid to have a consistent classification and management of all resources, have you considered global politics or governance regulations and acts? I think this question goes to Scott and Don. Would any of you like to comment on this part of the space that we have been discussing? Don, I see you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, so I think that the tool itself lends itself to testing various policies. So it does not require a particular policy. It's clearly going to surface the issue of different policies in different jurisdictions, but the tool will not be the policy determinant.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to add, if I may, to that, the whole point that the UN has tried to pursue with this is the idea that we are agnostic on politics and policies. We've tried to develop a tool that can actually embrace many different approaches and many different ways of seeing the resource world. We want to have a common vocabulary, one that's in numeric terms so that there's no loaded issues. Absolutely, if we're able to have a common framework across the globe, that will make sustainable resource management a better and more likely outcome.
Questions are pouring in. I see Kumar Moitra has a long question. Is it possible to give him the floor, Harry?
Just give me 1 moment to do that, Kumar. Is it? I'm unable to find him in the list. So if you can move to the next question. 1 minute, yeah.
I've made him a presenter, Harry.
Oh, okay, great. So, Mr. Moitra, you can unmute and ask the question yourself.
Good morning, good evening to everybody. Here I am. I am actually from India, ex-Geological Survey of India. I retired as director, coal wing of the GSI. And what I actually, this was my only feeling, that there should be a common platform for such classifications. Of late, there are many classifications floated over the and all these classifications have diverse, thinking or approaches and all. UNFC could be a tool which should be accepted by most of the nations, irrespective of their political thinking or their rules and all these things, so that a commercial or collaborative programs or agreements can be made based on this particular classification on natural resources. That is what I commented. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You could comment on this yourself, Harry, if you like.
Yeah, I think Scott has answered it somewhat, but I think having a classification today is very much in to see how we are aligned with the global policies. Almost every country is signed up on carbon reduction. There are zero carbon targets which are announced by number of countries, European Union, UK, China has announced it, zero carbon policy. So that is a kind of global policy. If you come to the investors like bankings, I today was in one investor conference, and the banks have their own zero carbon policies now. If they have a portfolio of energy projects or resource projects, mining projects, they expect that they will have a zero carbon target by 2030. So they have put in trillions of dollars. They, for example, HSBC put in $100 billion to support the carbon neutrality program. But they finished up their $100 billion in 1 year. And now they have increased it to $1 trillion. So this is just one bank trying to get aligned with the global policy on carbon reduction. Similarly, ESG, I mean, if you go to the mining projects, socially relevant, social aspects, how it is contributing to the wealth of the society, not for the entire country, but also for the local community. These are some of the things which are very much interesting for everyone. And the UNFC provides that kind of a framework which can build in all this together. Thank you. Over to you, Sigurd.
Thank you. I see there is some conversation on the chat about linking into the CRISCO and the PRMS. Dave, would you like to say a few words about how the UNFC nicely integrates with those two classifications?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's actually three questions, I think, that are sort of related to the same points there. One asking how a country that uses the UNFC could also use CRISCO, and another question about any comparisons between the codes before that. So if you go and read the UNFC documentation, the specifications and guidelines, which you can find on our website, of course, we say that that CRISCO and the Society of Petroleum Engineers, PRMS, for the purposes of minerals and petroleum, are really the foundations and keystones for the UNFC. We have bridging documents, which is essentially a mapping, but it's more in depth, in detail than a simple mapping that can take you from a UNFC estimate or a CRISCO estimate and translate back and forth between them. I oftentimes like to say that the UNFC is a bit like an international translator, in which you can feed the information into one language, and it comes out into another language as you want to. So if, for example, for petroleum, if you have the Russian Federation classification system, you can classify using the Russian system, then use the bridging document to translate that into the UNFC. And then you could then use the PRMS bridging document to take it back and to reflect those same values within the PRMS. So the UNFC is on its own a fine and really useful classification tool, but it can also be used as a way to link and bridge between other classification systems. Back to any other comments from you, Sigurd, on that? Or?
No, I think that is quite good. The UNFC is, of course, much more granular than the other systems. So if you have your inventory in the UNFC, you can report in the others more or less by aggregating. If you have it in the other systems, of course, then you need additional information especially on the environmental, social, and economic axis, which is absent in those classifications.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I probably should mention that. Sorry. I guess one other carrying on with that thought is that the UNFC being more granular, I believe that the reason we have a UNFC is because we recognize that there were some pieces that were missing from conventional classification systems, primarily on the looking at the maturity as a project develops. And the UNFC, by having these additional levels of granularity, really lets you identify what are the barriers to progression. And I'll give you a quick example of this, is that if you use most of the conventional systems, they'll have a category of contingent resources, volumes that are not yet ready to progress to reserves that get called pending. So these are ones that have some sort of a barrier to progression. You're not ready to make a final investment decision on them, but the impediments are not great. It's something that will be resolved within a short period of time. But there's no definition as to what that is. Is it an economic issue? Is it a financial issue? Is it a social or environmental issue? Is it a technical issue? Those things aren't identified within these other classification systems, whereas the UNFC does make it very clear what the impediment is, which then allows you to start progressing that project more quickly, be able to put the right resources to it.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Since you are still on that axis, there was a question earlier on how to address digital technology under the technology axis. Many of the operations are becoming more automated, digital in this way. So this is a very appropriate question in that context, I think.
Yeah, well, I don't really see that there's any difference in the way we would handle digital technology advancements. I think it's just if it's a different technology and route to achieve along your capital value process to progress a project. There may be some requirements, perhaps in governments going forward, that certain types of digital technologies need to be gathered. Maybe you need to have continuous monitoring of emissions or something like that. If it's those sorts of technologies, those will become requirements on the E-axis, actually. But for the development of the project itself, measuring the advancement of the technology readiness factors, I don't really see that there's a significant difference whether it's a digital or a non-digital activity.
Thank you, Dave. I think Matthias has something to add. Sure. Matthias, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I fully agree with Dave. And furthermore, I think the F-axis really stands for feasibility. So technical feasibility is not necessarily focusing on technology. It just means, is it feasible to make this project? Now, of course, coming to the point of digital, there might be new digital technologies out there that make projects feasible today that weren't feasible yesterday. So if I think about decentralized energy distribution and provision, we come from a world where electricity was provided only by a few major corporations, and they distributed it through the grid. And now we have a much more decentralized options where digital technologies actually provide supply and demand balance on a decentralized way. And that's actually a progress where technology makes things happen today that weren't possible yesterday. But in terms of the UNFC, nothing is new here because there was always new technology that made projects feasible today that weren't feasible yesterday.
Thank you, Matthias. Over to you, Sigurd.
I'm watching the watch and I see that we are 4 minutes over. So I think we have to simply promise that we will respond to the questions that we haven't had time to answer by email after the call. And in closing, I would like to say that from what we heard, there is no doubt that the agenda set for reaching the Sustainable Development Goals will require a new and strong public-private partnership, where the UN and the governments set the required framework conditions to allow the industry to deploy its best capabilities in ways that the capital market can finance. So this structure makes the parties dependent on one another, while of course they have to look after their proper interests. But to reach the Sustainable Development Goals successfully, UNFC numbers must be available right from the project levels and aggregated to the level at which the decisions are shaped. And I think this is the strength of the UN and UNEC efforts here, that the strings are tied right from where policies are being considered to the projects that can reveal what the effects are on the economy and also on the people affected by that economy. So this rigor is essential to navigate the waters that Scott laid out for us in his excellent introductory speech. So with that, I have nothing more to say. I really thank everyone for coming to the webinar and for the very insightful and interesting presentations and questions that followed. So to you all, thank you very, very much. It has made this an essential webinar.
Thank you, Sigurd, and I would also like to thank all the excellent speakers for their presentation and all of you for the good questions you have asked, many of them which are not answered yet, but we will try to get back to you. For more information, visit our website. We have all the documents there on various aspects that were discussed here. I would also like to draw your attention to our annual UNEC Resource Management Week, which will be happening during 26 to 30 April. We will have a hybrid session, so you can participate either virtually or physically in this session, which is very much required in this era of restricted travel. We are hoping to have a 5 full day of discussions on these topics and much more. That will be about 20 hours of online conversation about this matter. So if you have not done registering for this event so far, I will invite you to go to the registration link which is shown here, as well as it is available in our website. Please go and register for this event. Once again, thank you very much for all of you for being patient, and with 7 minutes we are over time, and I hope to see you all soon in our next event. Thank you once more. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Have a